the
This
property.
is my garden. Why would I step away?
I said put down the tools. Now.
Young man, I live here. I'm gardening. What exactly is the problem?
You're refusing to follow my instructions.
I'm asking for a reason. This is my home.
All right, that's it. Get on the ground.
Just 11 minutes on a quiet Saturday morning in a nice neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. 11 minutes that ended one man's entire career, cost the city over $600,000, and turned a 72-year-old woman planting petunias in her own front yard into a national symbol of everything broken about the way some people see other people. It was 10:18 in the morning. The birds were doing what birds do on Saturday mornings in the Arizona desert, making noise, being unbothered, minding their own business. The kind of morning where you can smell someone's coffee from across the street, and the whole neighborhood feels like it's still waking up slowly and nobody's in a hurry about anything. And right in the middle of that perfectly ordinary morning, Officer Brandon Cole made a decision so breathtaking in its stupidity, so completely divorced from logic, common sense, basic human decency, and, this part matters, the law, that within 48 hours it would be over. His badge, his career, his future in law enforcement. Gone. All of it. Before the weekend was done. The woman he decided to confront was not a trespasser. She was not a burglar. She was not acting suspiciously. She was not causing any kind of disturbance or breaking any kind of law. She was doing exactly what it looked like she was doing. Kneeling in a flower bed in front of a house she had owned for 40 years, pressing the roots of freshly bought flowers into the warm desert soil, with a trowel in her hand and a watering can sitting on the rocks beside her. Her name was Eleanor Beatrice Washington. She was 72 years old. She was a retired judge who had spent 31 years on the bench of the state's Superior Court. She was wearing a pale green gardening shirt and had soil on her gloves and was trying to get a stubborn root ball to sit right before the morning got too warm. And in about 4 minutes, Officer Brandon Cole was going to put her face down on the rocks in her own yard and handcuff her wrists behind her back. Stay with me, because what happens next and what happens after that and what gets uncovered when someone finally starts pulling on the right threads, all of it is going to make your jaw drop. And the body camera caught every single second of it. Eleanor Washington had lived at 318 Saguaro Crest Lane in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson for almost exactly 40 years. She and her late husband, Clarence, had bought the house in 1984 when their son Marcus was 6 years old and their daughter Renee was 3. They had looked at 11 houses before they found this one, and Eleanor had known the moment she walked through the front door. She told Clarence right there in the entryway, before they'd even seen the kitchen. This is the one. Clarence had passed away 5 years ago. Heart failure, sudden, 2 days after what had seemed like a minor procedure. Here, one morning, gone that afternoon, in a way that still didn't feel entirely real to Eleanor even now, even 5 years on. Marcus lived in Atlanta. Renee came over twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, sometimes just to sit on the back patio and drink iced tea and not talk about anything in particular, which Eleanor had come to understand was its own form of love. The house was a classic Southwestern ranch style, low, wide, rooted to the earth the way houses in that part of Arizona tend to be. The front yard was desert landscaping, which Eleanor had designed herself over the years with the patient, deliberate care of someone who understood that the best gardens don't fight their climate, they work with it. Smooth river rocks in graduated sizes. 3 large saguaro cacti that had been there since before she bought the place. Hardy desert shrubs that bloomed in spring with colors so vivid they looked painted on. And along the front edge of the property, where the yard met the low decorative wall, a series of flower beds that Eleanor maintained with particular attention and particular pride. Every Saturday morning, weather and arthritis permitting, she spent 2 to 3 hours out there. It was her ritual, her reset, the thing that reminded her body it still worked and reminded her mind that some problems can actually be solved by just kneeling down and putting your hands in the soil. That Saturday, she was planting flowers she'd picked up from the nursery the afternoon before. Bright tangerine marigolds and deep violet salvia. Colors that would pop against the sandy palette of the desert landscaping and look, she decided, absolutely spectacular from a street. She had the flat of flowers open beside her, the trowel working the earth, and she was entirely in her own world, which is exactly how gardening is supposed to feel. She did not hear Officer Brandon Cole pull up. Now let's talk about Brandon Cole for a moment, because understanding who he was matters for understanding what happens next. Brandon Cole was 25 years old. He had been on the Tucson Police Department for 3 years, which sounds like long enough to know what you're doing until you realize it's also just long enough to have become very confident about things you haven't actually thought through. He had been driving a routine patrol loop through the Catalina foothills that morning, a neighborhood of well-maintained homes, mature desert landscaping, and residents who had, by and large, owned their properties for decades. He turned on his Saguaro Crest Lane, and he saw Eleanor. And something, not logic, not training, not any articulable law enforcement rationale, just something in the wiring of his assumptions told him that this image was wrong. An elderly black woman in this neighborhood, kneeling in a yard, doing what looked like yard work. Her silver Acura SUV was parked in the driveway right behind her. The front door of the house was closed. There was no sign of disturbance, no broken window, no open gate, no vehicle he didn't recognize, no indication of anything except a woman gardening on a Saturday morning. But his mind had already done what untrained, unexamined minds do. It had sorted the image into a category, and the category it chose was wrong. He parked his cruiser. He got out. He walked up a driveway with his right hand resting on the grip of his service weapon, not reaching for it, just resting on it, the way some officers do when they want the person they're approaching to understand without words that this is a situation where they are in charge. His body camera was running. "Mom, stop what you're doing, put down the tools, and step away from the property." Eleanor looked up. She genuinely had not heard him approach. She'd been focused on the root ball and the soil, and she needed a moment to process that there was a uniformed police officer standing at the end of her driveway, hand on his weapon, speaking to her like she was in the middle of committing some kind of crime. "This is my garden," she said reasonably. "Why would I step away? Put the tools down. Now, here's where I want you to pause for just a second and put yourself in Eleanor's position. You are 72 years old. You are in your own front yard. You have lived in this house for 40 years. You have soil on your gloves and flowers in the ground, and a watering can sitting next to you on the rocks. A police officer has just driven up and told you to put down your gardening trowel and step away from your own property. What do you do? What does any reasonable person do? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because I genuinely want to know what you think. And keep that question in your mind as we keep going, because Eleanor's answer is coming, and it is magnificent. Eleanor set down the trowel. She wasn't going to fight about a trowel, and used her knees and the low garden wall to push herself slowly to her feet. Her knees, as they did every morning, had strong opinions about being asked to operate after 20 minutes of kneeling. She was 5'3", maybe 110 pounds, and she moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman in her 70s who has learned that rushing is rarely worth the cost. "Young man," she said, brushing the soil off her gloves with calm, practiced hands. "I live here. I'm doing my gardening. What exactly is the problem?" Now here is the moment where, if Brandon Cole had any working instinct for de-escalation, any at all, this story ends. He looks at the house. He looks at the car in the driveway. He asks himself one single question. Is there any actual reason to believe this woman does not live here? He finds no answer. He says good morning, apologizes for the interruption, and goes back to his patrol route. Eleanor goes back to her marigolds. That's how this should have gone. Instead, Cole's mind did something that revealed everything about how his assumptions were operating. She says she lives here, and that makes him more suspicious. In his experience, people who are doing something wrong always have an explanation ready. The explanation itself became evidence of guilt. The innocence looked like a cover story. "You're refusing to comply with my instructions," he said. Eleanor's expression shifted from confused to something sharper. She had spent 31 years on the Superior Court bench. She had presided over thousands of cases. She had watched hundreds of attorneys and officers present arguments and evidence in her courtroom. She understood the law, and she understood specifically, precisely, with no ambiguity, that what was happening right now was not lawful. I'm asking for a reason, she said. This is my home. All right, that's it. Get on the ground. Hands behind your head. The yard went quiet. Eleanor Washington stared at Officer Brandon Cole. He was young enough to be her grandson. He was standing in her driveway, on her property, with his hand on a weapon, ordering her to lie face down on the decorative rocks she had personally arranged over the course of 2 decades, in a flower bed she had planted herself, in front of a house she had owned since before this young man was born. "Excuse me," she said. "I said get on the ground. Now." And here, with 31 years of Superior Court experience and the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who knows exactly what her rights are and exactly what the law requires, Eleanor Washington said what I think most of us would be too frightened to say. "Officer, I will not get on the ground. I am a 72-year-old woman with arthritis in both knees. I just stood up. I'm standing in my own yard where I have lived for 40 years. You have not told me what I've done wrong, because I haven't done anything wrong. You have no legal grounds to detain me on my own property. And I would like your badge number and your supervisor's name right now." She said it the way she'd said things from the bench for 3 decades. Not loudly, not hysterically, just clearly, firmly, and with the complete absence of any intention to negotiate. Cole moved closer. His hand was no longer resting on the weapon. It was gripping it. "You are refusing a lawful order. That's obstruction." "It is not a lawful order," Eleanor said. "You have no probable cause. You have no reasonable suspicion. You cannot detain a person on their own property without articulating a specific legal basis. I'm asking you one more time, badge number and supervisor's name." Across the street, a man named Gerald Okafor had come out to water his own plants when he heard the raised voices and looked over. Gerald was 58. He'd lived across from Eleanor for 17 years. She had come to his daughter's graduation party. She had written Gerald's nephew a recommendation letter for the police academy, the irony of which, standing there watching this, was not lost on him. He had his phone out before he even made a conscious decision to record. "Officer," Gerald called across the street. "That's Judge Washington. She lives there. What are you doing?" Cole spun toward him. "Sir, step back. This doesn't involve you. It involves me when I'm watching my neighbor get treated like a criminal in her own yard. That is retired Judge Eleanor Washington. She has lived in that house since I was in my 20s. Cole turned back to Eleanor. His voice had gone flat in the particular way that voices go flat when someone has decided that control of the situation matters more than the situation itself. "Final warning. Get on the ground, or I will put you on the ground." And this is the moment, right here, where the story stops being an overreach and becomes something else. Because Eleanor Washington's hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger. The deep, ancient, exhausting anger of a woman who had spent 31 years building a career in service of justice, who had given her life to the law, who had made the law work for people who had every reason to doubt it could, and who was now standing in her own garden being threatened with physical force by a 25-year-old who had decided without a single piece of evidence that she didn't belong there. "I want her badge number," she said. "I want your supervisor's name, and I want your full name. Right now." Cole grabbed her arm. "You're under arrest." Eleanor pulled away, the instinctive, entirely human reaction of anyone who gets grabbed without warning. "Don't you put your hands on me." What happened in the next 11 seconds was captured from 4 different angles. Cole wrenched her arm behind her back. Eleanor cried out, a sharp, reflexive sound that Gerald heard from across the street and would later describe as the worst sound he'd ever heard from a neighbor. Cole forced her forward and down, toward the rocks at the edge of the flower bed. Gerald was screaming. A woman named Diana Chaby had come running out of the house next door, phone up, recording. 2 other neighbors had appeared on their front steps. Someone on the street was calling 911 to report a police officer assaulting an elderly woman. Eleanor could not do what Cole was demanding, not because she was fighting him, but because her body, 72 years old, arthritic knees, a shoulder that had been giving her trouble since the previous winter, simply could not fold itself flat onto the hard, uneven surface of the decorative rocks. Not quickly, not without injury. "I can't get down that way," she said, strained, pressed against his grip. "My knees, they don't bend like that anymore." You should have thought about that before you resisted. He pushed harder. Eleanor went down onto her stomach on the rocks, crying out as her shoulder hit the ground. Cole put his knee on her back and reached for his handcuffs. Gerald was beside himself. Diane had moved closer, still recording, still shouting. 3 other neighbors had come outside. Someone was calling Eleanor's name. Someone was yelling at Cole to stop. The handcuff clicked onto Eleanor's left wrist. The metal was too tight. She gasped, "Officer." Her voice was thin, pressed flat, her cheek against the rocks. Marigold petals had scattered around her head when she fell, orange against the gray stones, vivid and absurd. "I am a retired Arizona Superior Court judge. My identification is inside the house. If you let me stand up, I can show you." Cole paused. The word hung in the warm morning air. "Judge." Gerald had said it. Diane had said it. Multiple neighbors were saying it. Cole looked at the house. Well-maintained, expensive neighborhood, professional landscaping, not the kind of property that belongs to someone doing yard work for hire. He looked at the silver Acura in the driveway. Late model, clean, no visible damage. He looked at the flat of nursery flowers sitting open beside the disturbed earth of the flower bed. He looked at the gardening gloves on the low wall where Eleanor had set them. And then he looked at Eleanor Washington, face down on the rocks in her own yard, 72 years old, in a pale green gardening shirt, one wrist handcuffed, flowers scattered around her, crying quietly from the pain in her shoulder and the humiliation of what was happening to her in front of her neighbors in her home. The reality of what he had done arrived. It always arrives, just usually too late. You're a judge?" "Retired Superior Court," Eleanor said. 31 years. A long pause. "I'm going to let you up," Cole said quietly. "How very generous," Eleanor replied. He helped her to her feet. She winced as she stood. Her shoulder, her knees, the wrist where the cuff had bitten in. He removed the handcuff. There was already a red mark forming on her skin, deepening toward a bruise even as he watched. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said. Eleanor looked at him for what must have felt like a very long time. "A misunderstanding," she said, and her voice had that quality that courtroom veterans develop, quiet, precise, and carrying the weight of everything it's choosing not to shout. A misunderstanding is when 2 people have different information. You had all the information you needed. You had a woman in her own yard, on her own property, doing her own gardening, who told you she lived there, whose neighbors confirmed she lived there, who asked you calmly and repeatedly what she had done wrong. That is not a misunderstanding. You put your hands on me. You forced me to the ground. You handcuffed me. You caused me injury. In my own front yard, while I was planting flowers. That is not a misunderstanding. That is assault." Gerald was still recording from across the street. "Judge Washington," he called over. "Do you want me to call Marcus?" "Please," Eleanor said, "and call my attorney." She looked at Cole one last time. "You saw a black woman doing yard work in a nice neighborhood," she said, "and you assumed I was the help. Isn't that right?" It wasn't a question. Cole said nothing. "Get off my property," Eleanor said, "and expect to hear from my attorney Monday morning." Cole walked back to his cruiser. His hands were shaking. You can see it on the body camera footage, the slight tremor as he reached for the door handle. He got in. He sat there. The neighbors were still outside. Multiple cameras had captured everything. His own body camera had captured everything. He had handcuffed and forced to the ground a retired Superior Court judge in her own front yard for the crime of planting marigolds, on camera, in front of a dozen witnesses. His career was over. He just didn't know it yet. Now, stay with me here, because this next part is where the story gets even more important, because what happened after Cole drove away reveals something much bigger than one bad officer on one bad morning. It reveals a system that had been quietly failing for years. Eleanor went inside. Her shoulder was throbbing. Her knees were scraped. She had rocks embedded in the fabric of her gardening shirt from where she'd gone down. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, breathing, and then she did what 31 years on the bench had trained her to do. She secured the evidence. Her doorbell camera, a wide-angle model that covered the driveway and a large portion of the front yard, had recorded everything from a completely separate angle. She opened the app on her phone and watched it. There she was. There was Cole. There was every second of the 11 minutes, from a different perspective than his body camera. She emailed the footage to herself at 4 different addresses. She uploaded it to 2 separate cloud storage services. She saved screenshots of the timestamps. She wrote out a handwritten account of everything she remembered while it was fresh, signed it, and dated it. She was a retired judge. She understood evidence. She was not going to give anyone any room to maneuver. Then she called the chief of police directly. She had his number. Judges, over 31 years, tend to collect the numbers of people worth knowing. He answered on the second ring. She told him what had happened. She used clean, factual language. She mentioned the body camera, the doorbell camera, and the multiple neighbor recordings. She mentioned the marks on her wrist and the scrapes on her knees. She told him she expected someone at her door within the hour. He told her someone would be there in 45 minutes. Her daughter Renee arrived first, 20 minutes after the call, still in the sweatshirt she'd been wearing at home when Gerald tracked down her number. When she saw the bruise forming on her mother's wrist and the scrapes visible through the torn fabric at her knees, she didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood there with the particular expression of a person whose grief has converted entirely and immediately into something harder and more purposeful. "We're getting every lawyer we know on the phone," Renee said. "Already handled," Eleanor said. "Sit down. I'll make tea." Lieutenant Priscilla Odia arrived 40 minutes after the call. She was thorough, professional, and visibly troubled by what she was watching on both video feeds. She photographed Eleanor's wrist, her knees, the disturbed flower bed, the scattered marigold petals still on the rocks. She took formal statements from Eleanor, from Gerald Okafor, from Diane Achebe, and from 3 other neighbors who had witnessed the incident. She collected copies of every phone recording. By the time she left, she had 6 independent witness accounts and 4 separate video recordings of the incident, on top of Cole's own body camera footage. By that evening, a local news producer had the doorbell camera footage. By 9 o'clock, it was the lead story on every Tucson station. Retired judge, 72, handcuffed in own yard while gardening. By Sunday morning, the body camera footage had been released. 14 million views before noon. National news. Cable networks. The story was everywhere. The comment section of every post was running about 95% in one direction. And here's where I need you to really pay attention, because this next part is what changes the story from outrage to something that actually matters. Something that has real lessons for all of us about how institutions fail and what it takes to fix them. Internal Affairs opened Monday morning. The investigator assigned was Commander Patricia Nwosu, a 27-year department veteran who had a reputation so straightforward it was almost uncomfortable. She followed the evidence, she wrote what she found, and she didn't soften it for anyone's comfort regardless of rank or politics. For chiefs had tried, in various ways, to influence her investigations. None had succeeded. She was exactly the right person for this case. She started with the videos. All of them, in full multiple times. She watched Cole's body camera from his perspective. She watched the doorbell camera from the front. She watched Gerald's recording from across the street, Diane's from next door, and a recording nobody had mentioned yet from a neighbor on the second floor of the house on the corner who had filmed the whole thing from above and at an angle that showed, with complete clarity, the moment Eleanor went down on the rocks. Then Commander Nwosu pulled Cole's service record. And here's where this story goes from being about one Saturday morning to being about something much larger. Over 3 years on the force, Officer Brandon Cole had generated excessive force complaints at a rate nearly 4 times the departmental average. 7 separate complaints from 7 separate individuals, each claiming Cole had used more force than the situation required. Each complaint had been reviewed. Each complaint had been dismissed. Insufficient evidence, no misconduct found. Officer's account deemed credible, file closed. Here is what should have been obvious from the first day. Anyone laid all 7 files side by side and looked at them together. Every single complainant was a person of color. 3 black, 2 Hispanic, 2 of Middle Eastern descent. Not one white individual had ever filed an excessive force complaint against Brandon Cole. Not one. And yet every complaint had been evaluated alone, in isolation, by a different supervisor, with no one asking the question that screams itself when you see all 7 together. Is there a pattern here? There was a pattern. There absolutely was a pattern. Commander Nwosu did not just read the reports. She pulled every piece of body camera footage associated with every complaint. Footage that previous investigators had technically reviewed, but it became painfully clear had not looked at with any real scrutiny. The first case she examined involved a young black man, 19 years old, stopped while walking through a shopping center parking lot on a weekday afternoon. Cole's report stated the young man had been uncooperative and had made movements that Cole interpreted as potentially threatening, requiring a physical takedown for officer safety. The body camera showed a teenager who was cooperative, who complied with every initial instruction, and who was in the process of walking away, back turned, moving in the other direction, when Cole grabbed him from behind and put him on the pavement. The young man suffered a dislocated shoulder and a laceration on his chin that needed stitches. The complaint was dismissed because Cole's report characterized it as a necessary intervention. The body camera showed a boy's back as Cole's hands reached into the frame. The second case involved a black woman in her 40s who had been stopped while sitting in her car in a bank parking lot. Cole's report stated she had reached toward the floor of the vehicle in a manner that suggested concealment of a weapon, requiring the deployment of pepper spray for officer safety. The body camera showed the woman's hands visible on the steering wheel throughout the entire exchange. She never moved them. She was pepper sprayed while sitting completely still, hands in plain sight, having done nothing. The complaint was dismissed on the grounds that Cole's perception of threat was reasonable given the circumstances. The body camera showed no circumstances that would be reasonable grounds for anything. The third case involved a Hispanic man in his 50s stopped for a broken taillight, a minor equipment violation, a fix-it ticket, the kind of stop that should take 4 minutes, and end with a thank you, have a good evening. Cole's report stated the man had been argumentative and had reached toward the center console repeatedly despite instructions to keep his hands visible. The body camera showed a man who asked twice, calmly, why he was being stopped, then fell silent and kept his hands on the wheel. He was removed from the vehicle, placed on the hood, and handcuffed for what Cole's report described as officer safety concerns. The man spent an hour on the side of the road before being released with no charges. His complaint was dismissed. The footage showed no basis for any of it. Case after case, the same structure. Cole's written report describing behavior that would justify force. The body camera contradicting the written report. The complaint reviewed in isolation. The dismissal stamped. The file closed. Nobody connecting the thread that ran through all of them because nobody was looking for a thread. Commander Nwosu also pulled Cole's training records. He had completed de-escalation training. He had passed the assessments. His scores were adequate. His real-world behavior showed not a single trace of any principle from any of it. His first move in every encounter was force or the credible threat of force. There was no assessment, no communication attempt, no moment of considering whether the situation actually required anything at all. The training had happened. It simply hadn't taken. Her report ran to 71 pages. Her conclusion was the kind of clear, direct, fully documented finding that leaves no room for anyone to claim they didn't understand what was being said. Officer Brandon Cole demonstrates a documented, consistent, and escalating pattern of disproportionate force deployed exclusively against individuals of color, accompanied by incident reports that materially misrepresent what the body camera footage shows. His assault on retired Judge Eleanor Washington is not an anomaly. It is the inevitable outcome of a pattern that should have been identified and addressed years ago. The department's failure to identify this pattern through routine supervisory review represents a serious institutional failure that must be addressed as urgently as the termination of Cole's employment. Her recommendation: immediate termination, referral to the county attorney for criminal charges, and a full 10-year review of how excessive force complaints had been evaluated and closed by supervisors. Officer Brandon Cole was fired within 48 hours of the incident. It was the fastest termination in the Tucson Police Department's history. His law enforcement certification was suspended. He was escorted out. His access was revoked. It didn't stop there. The Pima County attorney reviewed Commander Nwosu's report and the full evidence package and filed criminal charges: assault in the second degree, unlawful restraint, and civil rights violations under Arizona state law. Cole was arrested, booked, and released on bond. His attorney issued a statement saying Cole had been responding in good faith to what he believed was a possible trespassing situation and deeply regretted any distress caused. Eleanor, Washington's attorney, issued a response the same afternoon. It was 4 sentences long, and each sentence was doing exactly the work it was meant to do. Judge Washington was assaulted in her own front yard while gardening on a Saturday morning. She sustained documented physical injuries and was subjected to a false arrest for which no legal justification existed. She is fully prepared to pursue all available remedies in both state and federal court. She does not require the money, but accountability, she has always believed, requires a public record. The federal civil rights lawsuit named Cole personally and the city of Tucson as defendants. It alleged assault, battery, false arrest, unlawful imprisonment, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, violation of 14th Amendment equal protection rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and municipal liability for the city's documented failure to supervise, train, and discipline an officer with a known history of misconduct complaints. The city's legal team sat with the evidence package for 6 days before calling Eleanor's attorney to begin settlement discussions. What they had in front of them was this: 2 independent video recordings of the full incident, 6 eyewitness statements, photographic documentation of Eleanor's injuries, a 71-page internal affairs report establishing a 3-year pattern backed by body camera footage contradicting Cole's own written accounts, a defendant who had already been criminally charged, and a plaintiff who was a retired Superior Court judge with 31 years of public record, impeccable credibility, and a complete understanding of exactly how every stage of this litigation would proceed. They settled in 5 weeks. $620,000, plus a mandatory reform package that Eleanor's attorney refused to soften by a single clause, and the city, facing the evidence in front of them, had no realistic basis for contesting. The reforms required a complete revision of use of force policy with mandatory input from civil rights organizations before any version could be adopted. Mandatory de-escalation training for every officer, not once, but with quarterly scenario-based practical assessments rather than written tests. A dedicated pattern analysis unit responsible for quarterly review of all use of force incidents, with explicit authority to flag individual officers and require supervisory intervention regardless of whether any individual complaint had been sustained. An independent civilian oversight board with full subpoena power and unrestricted access to body camera footage, and an automatic referral to the county attorney for any officer who accumulated 3 or more excessive force complaints within any rolling 24-month period, regardless of how each individual complaint had previously been resolved. The settlement also required something that had never before been required of an Arizona law enforcement agency in a civil settlement: full public disclosure of all excessive force complaint data for the preceding 10 years. Not summaries, not statistics. Full data, officer names, complaint details, investigation outcomes, demographic information about the subjects, all of it broken down and published so that patterns that had been hiding inside individual files could never hide that way again. An independent federal monitor was appointed to oversee implementation and report publicly every 6 months. If compliance was found inadequate, additional penalties could be imposed by the court. There was no sunset clause. There was no expiration date. The accountability was permanent and public. Now I want to come back to Eleanor because she is the reason any of this matters, and I don't want the reforms and the settlement figures to be the last thing you're thinking about when this story ends. 3 months after that Saturday morning, on a cool late autumn Saturday, with the kind of clear Tucson sky that makes you feel like you can see all the way to the edge of the world, Eleanor Washington was back in her yard. She had bought new flowers, more marigolds, more salvia, the same color she had been planting when Cole pulled up, because she had decided that if this story was going to follow her name around for the rest of her life, The least it could do was note that she had excellent taste. The flower beds looked exactly as she had planned them. Maybe better, actually, because she'd had 3 months to think about the arrangement. A reporter from a local paper had come the week before to ask how she was doing, whether she felt vindicated, whether the settlement had brought her peace. Eleanor had taken a long moment before answering. "I don't think about vindication," she said, finally. "Vindication is about me, and this was never really about me. What I think about is the woman who doesn't have 31 years on the Superior Court bench. I think about the person who gets grabbed in their own yard and nobody on their street has a phone out and nobody knows their name and they don't know to call the chief directly and they don't know how to preserve digital evidence and they don't know what the Fourth Amendment actually requires of an officer before they can detain you. That person doesn't get a 71-page internal affairs report. That person gets a one-paragraph dismissal and a file that goes in a drawer and never gets connected to anything. That's who I think about. Every single day." The reporter asked what she wanted people to take away from the story. Eleanor pressed the last marigold of the morning into the earth and patted the soil firmly around it. "Know your rights," she said. "That's first. Know them specifically, not just in the general sense that you have them. Know what an officer can and cannot do. Know what probable cause means. Know what reasonable suspicion means. Know the difference between a lawful order and something said by someone in a uniform. Because those things are not the same." She picked up her trowel. "Document everything. The moment something happens, document it. Your phone is evidence. Your neighbor's phone is evidence. The doorbell camera you maybe haven't gotten around to installing is evidence. Get it. Use it. And third, never assume that injustice only happens somewhere else, on someone else's street, to someone who is less careful or less informed or less credentialed than you are. It happens on your street. It happened on mine, on a Saturday morning, while I was planting flowers." She paused. "And I want it noted," she added with a small, precise smile, "that the flowers turned out beautifully. Here is what 11 minutes costs when the assumptions inside them are wrong. It cost Brandon Cole his career, his certification, his freedom pending criminal trial, and any realistic path to employment in any field that runs a background check, which is most fields that are worth working in. It cost the city of Tucson $620,000 in direct settlement, plus the cost of implementing sweeping institutional reforms, plus legal fees on both sides, plus the slow and unglamorous and genuinely difficult work of rebuilding community trust one policy change and one public meeting at a time. It cost Eleanor Washington a Saturday morning, a bruised wrist, scraped knees, a shoulder that troubled her for months afterward, and something harder to name, the particular exhaustion of having to be, once again, the person through whom a system learns a lesson it should have already known. And it began because a 25-year-old officer looked at a 72-year-old woman pressing flowers into the soil of her own yard and decided, without evidence, without inquiry, without running a plate or checking a record or attempting a single moment of basic human communication, that she did not belong there. That assumption, the one that arrived before any conscious thought, the one he hadn't even fully formed before he was already acting on it, turned out to be the most expensive idea he ever had. Eleanor Washington finished her tea and looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The marigolds were going to be extraordinary this season. She was already planning where to put the spring plantings. She had a lot of Saturday mornings left, and she intended to use every single one of them exactly as she chose. If this story made you feel something, share it. If it made you think about the assumptions that live in all of us, unexamined and unchallenged until suddenly they're not, share it. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about what accountability actually looks like when someone refuses to let injustice be the final word. And drop a comment. Have you ever been in a place you absolutely belonged and been made to feel like you didn't? Tell your story. I want to read it. See you in the next one.